I was in the State Department the day of 9/11, and as soon as the second plane hit, you just knew that we would have to find out who did it and have those people pay a price.
I remember people being pretty honest about this new war on terror. And they said, yes, we're going to go to Afghanistan. But terrorism of this sort was a movement.
It looked like a simple picture. It was Afghanistan, it was Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. It was just that. But then it started to be about Saddam Hussein, about weapons of mass destruction. It became threats to North Korea. It became radicalism, jihadism. It became about ISIS.
It's hard to look at the last 20 years and think that the West's reaction to 9/11 hasn't made terrorism worse.
None of us had ever thought this would be a 20-year war. We didn't think this was going to be a substantially different kind of war we'd experienced before. The ideas of war happening in some country far away now entered a new world where these things could happen right there in our own neighborhood.
Almost every single thing that I have done over the last 20 years has been either directly or indirectly related to what we now call the war on terror.
There was this great anticipation in Washington. You recall when the president went to Ground Zero and said, basically, the terrorists will hear from us.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Everybody knew what that meant.
And when you heard President Bush talk about you're either with us or against it, that's the thing that stuck out to me. You're with us or against us? What does that really mean? Is the war on terror against everybody who doesn't help us, who isn't backing whatever it is we do? Is the war on terror against Pakistan? What is it exactly? And that was never defined carefully.
There was this real sense that Al-Qaeda might already have, quote, cells. Were there other sleeper cells in the United States ready to take action? There's been a surge in known Al-Qaeda operatives talking about attacking the U.S.
On October the 7th, 2001, I was lying in front of the TV with my baby son on my chest, fast asleep, and the TV suddenly cut into a live broadcast saying that the bombing had begun in Afghanistan.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
My wife, all the kids, we all bundled into the car, drove to Heathrow Airport. The last thing I said to my wife, she asked me how long did I think I was going to be away for, and I said a week, maybe 2 weeks. This could be a long trip. I didn't get home for 2 months. It was my first time in Afghanistan. I was in total shock at the country. I'd never seen anything like it. This was a country that was living hundreds of years in the past. It was a spectacular journey through a beautiful country, some incredible people who were very welcoming, people who had no sense whatsoever of what it was that was happening in their country.
I remember first going into Afghanistan, and I went in with Donald Rumsfeld, and we went all over. When I look at the names of where we went, and we went to Mazar-e-Sharif, we'd go to Helmand, and when I heard those names in the last few months, and the Taliban taking each of those places back, that stung.
I remember walking in to do a story about one of the schools for the kids, and all these little children over there were in an English class to learn English, but their teacher could barely speak English. It's hard for me to even think about how some of those children and the women we did stories about potentially going back to the way it was before.
I remember I reached out to a guy who was at my school who went on to be a reporter, and I said, what would you... And he said, the number one thing you have to remember is that any person you talk to, you will be putting in danger. Someone will spy on them and report them to the authorities, and that's their lives in danger. Remember that. So do not take this lightly.
People always ask me if I'm afraid. And I think there's a little probably gender stereotyping there, like, wait, you're a woman and you're in this war zone and weren't you scared? You've got ISIS in that factory right there.
Yes.
ISIS just there, and we're leaving now. In many ways, you're less afraid at the moment in your mind you accept that something bad can happen. So I remember the first time, and I was staying in Baghdad at one of the old Saddam Hussein palaces, and I know there's a rocket strike on the base there, and got up startled, but then you just got used to it. And you're like, oh, okay, I'm okay. Everybody seems okay, fine. Go back to sleep.
I almost feel like the body and the mind, when you go to places to cover wars that are potentially dangerous places, there's something that happens in the brain that keeps you from running in fear. And in Afghanistan, I almost felt like it was peaceful.
And I still remember that feeling of feeling the kind of the percussion wave hitting you for the first time, that feeling of not just hearing what a bomb sounds like, but just feeling it inside your body. And it was terrifying. First time I'd seen a dead body, first time you're seeing fighters dying on the side of the road, first time you're hearing the heavy clashes of open gunfights.
I didn't set out to be a journalist. Syria made me into a journalist. I was there to do my thesis on the Arab Spring. And it was actually only a friend who said to me, you do realize if you're in Syria, you should probably write for some newspapers because no one's allowed in. And that's when the uprisings started, and when I knew I had to be involved in some way in reporting what was happening in a country I loved.
In 2004, things are starting to fray around the edges. There was an ambush of some 1st Cavalry Division soldiers. And I said, I have to talk to those soldiers. I have to talk to those soldiers. Because it was the first, they'd lost 8 soldiers in one day. In one day, it was the largest loss of life for the 1st Cavalry Division since the Vietnam War. They had those soldiers lined up, and those were the most powerful stories, and remain that today, that I had heard in that war. There's one guy named Sergeant Robert Miltenberger who looked like the last thing on earth he wanted to do was be interviewed. And the moment I just said, tell me what happened, he started crying.
Charlie Company truck, just like the one we're riding in, rode down the road to us, 4 flat tires. Engine on fire.
I think those were stories I felt like Americans hadn't seen. And if you ask them what they're fighting for, it's just the guy to my left, my guy to the right, that's what I'm fighting for. That's what they were fighting for, because in many places they didn't really know what they were fighting for.
Well, I think there was some sense that this was going to be drawn out and that this was going to be long. If you really thought about what the intelligence and law enforcement officials were really saying.
The war on terror essentially allowed a lot of quote-unquote secular regimes in the Middle East to position themselves as allies of the West against Muslim terrorism. Leaders like Mubarak in Egypt and Assad in Syria were able to say to the United States and Europe, look, let me stay in power and I'll root out these terrorists who are a threat to you in the West. Syria became an enormous proxy war, and in the end, it became a hellscape of a civil war that killed thousands and thousands of people.
People take a lot of risk over there. There are a lot of journalists who've been hurt, and Bob Woodruff, of course, is one of them. And that story and Bob's story I was intimately involved in.
On World News Tonight, attacked in Iraq. ABC's Bob Woodruff and cameraman Doug Vogt severely wounded in a roadside bombing.
Especially in the beginning, it was really hard for me to give up the possibility of going and reporting in countries far away that were in the midst of conflict, even violent conflict. war conflict.
Having Bob injured changed me, and realize that all those things you shove in the back of your brain, for that to happen to Bob, changed me. It sobered me.
This is what Bob and Doug were doing shortly before the attack. They were riding in an Iraqi armored vehicle. They had 2 cameras, one in Doug's hands, the other attached to the front of the vehicle.
My days of going out and covering wars are over, because I promised to my wife and my kids that I would not cover wars anymore. I told, as a compromise, can I go cover conflicts? Those I do. The ones that at least seem to be safe to cover.
When President Bush left and I went to Crawford and talked to the president about him saying for so long, we're doing well, it's going well, and I said to him, why did you say that? Why did you keep saying that when you knew it wasn't? When you knew it wasn't? And he said, to keep the morale up.
When you say, we're winning, you know what the American people hear. You know how that will play.
You can't have the commander-in-chief say to a bunch of kids who are sacrificing it, either it's not worth it or you're losing.
And I said, they knew. If anyone knew, they knew it wasn't going well.
We just pulled out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of discussion about, okay, what does that mean for Al-Qaeda? Does it reform? ISIS is still a major threat. How does this impact the war on terror that we're not in Afghanistan in the way that we were?
It's so difficult to fight these ideologies, and these ideologies are bred on the idea that the West has an imperial overreach. And so really all we did was make ourselves more powerful and make ourselves more of a target. And I think it's really hard to see how anything really has changed in the last 20 years.
There's been a desire to pull out of Afghanistan for more than 10 years, because no one thought this was going to last this long. The U.S. is tired of wars. The ones that we fought in the Middle East were not very successful in terms of benefiting our country of America, except for keeping other terrorist attacks out of the U.S. In that sense, it was very successful so far. But it's tiring.
There isn't a simple answer. There isn't a simple solution. There isn't a simple target. The world, unfortunately, is just much more complex. And unless we get to some of the root causes of some of the anger that feeds hatred towards us, then things will never really change.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.